Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're diving straight into a concept that, well, it's been at the heart of some really explosive moments in history.
Absolutely. And it still fuels debates, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Everywhere.
It really does. We're talking about equality. Think of that revolutionary cry, liberty, equality, fraternity.
A powerful trio.
And equality alongside liberty, it stood as this incredibly potent ideal, often seen as, the fundamental voice against injustice.
The force for social change, definitely.
And today, our deep dive is guided by some really fascinating source material. It's an insightful exploration of equality, especially within political theory.
Yeah, it's great stuff. It gives us more than just a definition. It unpacks the history, the different ways people have understood this very complex idea.
And why it's been so contentious.
Exactly.
So here's our mission today. We want to really understand the nature, the essence of equality, specifically as presented in this source. How does it actually relate to that other huge ideal, liberty?
Mm-hmm. And justice, too.
Right. And pulling only from the arguments and the examples this material gives us. Why has equality been such a constant, sometimes really fiercely debated principle through history?
And for you, the listener, our goal is really to cut through some of the density here. This material, it's packed.
It is.
But we're going to highlight the core ideas, maybe some surprising turns in the arguments, the key thinkers it brings up.
So you get a clear, digestible understanding of the different facets of equality without needing to wade through the source yourself.
Think of it as getting the core insights sharp and clear.
Okay, let's get into it. One of the very first and maybe the most crucial points our source makes is just fundamental.
Yeah, it really sets the stage.
It draws this critical line saying that modern equality isn't actually a description of how things are, not reality.
Right. It's primarily a statement of right.
A statement of right. Explain that a bit more.
Well, this distinction is absolutely central to the source's whole argument. It means we aren't claiming, factually, that every single human being is identical.
Because clearly we're not in intelligence, strength, talents.
Exactly. All those things. The principle of equality asserts something different. It says that people must be treated as equal.
So it's prescriptive. It's telling us how things ought to be.
Precisely. How we ought to organize our societies, how we should interact. It's not just observing nature or how things happen to be right now.
That makes sense, because if it were just a statement of fact, well, you could disprove it just by looking around.
Easily, yeah.
So how does the source then build the case for this idea? Equality as a right. What's the logic it presents to support this must treat people equally idea?
Well, the material grounds this argument in a few different ways, often pointing to these shared human qualities that kind of transcend the surface differences. One line of reasoning, and this has deep historical roots, is the idea of humans as rational beings, endowed with reason.
So if we all possess reason,
Does that imply a fundamental equality, one that demands equal treatment regardless of other variations? That's one argument presented.
and there's a theological angle too.
Yes, another argument, drawing from various traditions, posits that all people are created equal by, a divine power.
And the source also brings up something more basic, maybe, our shared needs.
Exactly. That at a fundamental level, physical, emotional, intellectual needs were remarkably similar across humanity.
Right, we all need food, shelter, connection.
Precisely. And the argument flows from that. Because these core needs are similar, there's an entitlement to equal rights.
Okay.
But the source is careful here. It stresses again, this claim for equal rights is not based on us being equal in capacity or talent.
It's deeper than that.
It stems from these shared attributes or maybe underlying spiritual beliefs about basic human worth.
I found it interesting how the source even brings in biological examples to try and hammer this home. This idea of fundamental similarity beneath the surface.
Yeah, definitely.
Like mentioning, despite skin color differences, our blood's the same color.
Yes, that's one specific example it uses.
Mm-hmm.
It also notes that nature, in a basic biological sense, hasn't really created completely different types of human beings with different elements.
Right.
A drug, for instance. It affects people based on universal biological processes, not really race or social standing.
And blood donations, organ transplants.
That's another example cited. The possibility of these things across different groups. It suggests this shared biological reality that, well, proponents of equality have pointed to.
Trying to find a factual grounding for this ought.
Kind of, yeah. Trying to push back against arguments claiming inherent, maybe biologically based inequality. The source presents these as ways people have tried to justify the demand for equal treatment.
But then almost immediately the source pivots. It turns to the main argument against equality,
Right.
which often leans really heavily on this same idea of nature.
This is where you see the historical battle lines drawn. The counter-argument used again and again throughout history is basically that nature itself shows inequality everywhere.
Look around, it says.
Exactly. Look at the natural world. Sun and moon, unequal. Mountains, valleys, unequal. Different species, vastly different capabilities.
Strong versus weak, wise versus foolish.
All of that. So the argument goes, why should human society try to impose this, well, artificial equality that seems to go against the fundamental natural order?
And according to the source, who typically makes this argument? Who are the proponents?
The source connects this reasoning pretty directly to those who, well, benefit from existing inequalities.
Those who want to keep their privileges.
Essentially, yes. Those who wish to maintain their privileged positions, they look at the push for equality with some comprehension.
Because they see it undermining their achievements, their wealth, power, prestige.
Right. Things they believe are the result of their own superior abilities, their exercise of liberty.
So there's a fear there.
The fear they articulate is that limiting their liberty for the sake of promoting equality for others will actually harm society overall. By stifling the efforts of the most capable, the most productive people, it's seen as potentially detrimental to progress.
That's a really powerful claim, equality hurting progress, but the source challenges this directly, right?
And absolutely.
It says this view is based on a flawed, maybe a distorted understanding of liberty itself.
It does. The source asserts that within a society, real freedom, true freedom, can't actually be absolute freedom. It has to be necessarily equal freedom for everyone. Meaning, if liberty is just seen as this unfettered ability to act without any restraint, it just dissolves into the liberty of the strong to dominate the weak.
License to oppress.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes mere license for oppression.
And this is where that really vivid image from R.H. Tawney comes in, the one the source uses.
Exactly. It quotes Tawney directly. Freedom for the pike is death for the minnows.
Simple but effective.
Very. If the pikes, those with the power, the wealth, the strength, have absolute unchecked freedom, then the minnows, the vulnerable, they just get devoured.
So for liberty to actually mean something, to be universally applicable in a society,
It must be constrained by the principle of equality. My freedom is only really legitimate as long as it doesn't stomp on your equally valid freedom.
and the source pushes this idea further. It argues this isn't just about legal rights or some philosophical ideal. It has to apply in the real world.
Yes, it emphasizes this principle of equal freedom needs to be applied across the board, political, social, and economic spheres.
So from this viewpoint, bringing in equality isn't about weakening freedom.
No, it's about making freedom substantive, making it accessible for more people. If it means preventing some people from accumulating, say, unlimited power or wealth,
That's seen as a necessary check.
a necessary restriction on exploitation, yeah. Ensuring that others can also get a fair share of social benefits.
It's about preventing those benefits from being cornered by a small and vocal minority, as the source puts it, leaving others behind.
Right. That's the phrase used. So the fundamental takeaway from this part is that, according to this material, liberty and equality, viewed as essential human rights within society, they aren't necessarily opposing forces.
They come from the same place.
They arise from the same basic logic, serve the same social purpose, enabling a just, viable society where freedom is real for everyone, not just an elite few.
Okay. Moving on, the source makes a really striking point about the history of this whole idea. It argues that equality, especially as a demand to fix unjust inequalities, is actually a distinctly modern concept.
Yeah, this is a critical piece of historical context it provides.
Yeah.
For most of human history, think ancient times, medieval times, significant inequality, whether it's wealth, status, power.
It was just there, accepted.
Largely accepted, yeah, as a fundamental, maybe even unchangeable part of life.
So unlike today, where we often see inequality as a problem we need to solve,
Back then, it was just part of the landscape. The source mentions thinkers from those eras who often didn't even question the underlying structure.
they didn't challenge it.
Not fundamentally. As the sociologist Tom Bottomore observed, they tended to rationalize it, justify the existing social order, sometimes using religious doctrines to explain or legitimize the hierarchy.
Like enslaved societies, feudal systems, caste systems.
Exactly. The social order was often seen as fixed, almost like nature, something humans couldn't or shouldn't try to change.
It was presented as the natural way or the divine way.
Right. And philosophical or ethical discussions back then often focused more on how individuals should behave within their given status.
Not questioning the status itself.
Generally, no. Not questioning the legitimacy of the hierarchy. This was mostly before the widespread use of rational empirical thinking applied to social stuff.
So what changed? What triggered this huge shift towards seeing inequality as potentially unjust and maybe even alterable?
The source links this shift directly to the rise of the scientific age. As people started understanding and using rational empirical methods to control the natural world.
Through science technology?
Right. They began turning that same analytical lens onto their own social structures. Thinkers started asking these critical questions that hadn't really been widely asked before. Like how much of the inequality we see is just a product of social arrangements, things humans created.
And if they're human creations.
Can they be changed by changing the structure?
Yeah.
And crucially, if these inequalities can be changed, are they reasonable? Are they justified?
So the possibility of changing inequality became thinkable. Because we saw we could change other things we once thought were fixed.
Exactly. And the intellectual project kind of became, let's identify and remove those social inequalities that seem both unreasonable from a justice standpoint and removable through conscious human effort.
This really reinforces that idea of equality being intrinsically linked to demanding social change.
It absolutely does. And the source brings in Rousseau here to help clarify things. Rousseau made this really important distinction.
Between two types of inequality.
Yes. What he called natural or physical inequality differences in age, health, strength, maybe mental qualities. He saw those mostly as facts of nature.
Unchangeable, basically.
Largely. And then there was conventional or moral inequality. This is about the privileges, the wealth, the power granted to some people at the expense of others.
And that kind is artificial, man-made.
Precisely. It arises from the social order that humans construct. And recognizing this distinction is huge because it opens the door to fundamental social critique.
And restructuring.
Right. If inequalities aren't just natural facts, but products of human design, then humans can redesign the social order based on different ideas of justice.
That connects directly back to that quote from the French Declaration you mentioned earlier.
It does. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be based only upon public utility.
That's a flat-out rejection of conventional inequality based on birth or status. A foundational statement.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the source goes on to point out something else interesting. Science and tech are actually blurring Rousseau's line even further now.
How so?
Well, things once considered purely natural and unalterable, like health, maybe strength, even cognitive abilities, appearance,
They can be changed now.
significantly modified, yeah, through medicine, nutrition, education, training, even things like cosmetic surgery.
That's a fascinating point, technology changing what we even consider natural.
Yeah.
But the source quickly links this back to the social structure, doesn't it?
Yes, and this is the critical bit. The access to all these interventions and benefits, the advanced healthcare, the top-tier education, the nutritional support.
Depends on your status, your wealth.
Overwhelmingly, yes. It depends on socioeconomic status, and this just reinforces the central argument. Deprivation and disadvantage for huge numbers of people aren't just unavoidable results of nature or fate.
They're consequences of social distinctions.
To a very large extent, yes. Consequences of the prevailing social distinctions and inequalities.
So the demand for equality, in this modern sense, it's fundamentally a demand to change those parts of the social structure.
The parts that create, maintain, or worsen those alterable, unjust inequalities. That's the core argument presented here.
It quotes John Rees saying equality becomes powerful when inequalities are seen as both unjust and alterable.
Exactly. If something is seen as unjust but truly unalterable, the source uses the example of the burden of childbearing for women, seen perhaps as unjust by some, but historically viewed as a biological fact.
It doesn't become a political demand in the same way.
Typically not for political or social restructuring, no. Not in the same way as, say, poverty caused by economic structures.
And the source also clarifies not every difference that can be changed is seen as unjust.
Right. Things like the authority a teacher has over a student or a doctor over a patient, rational differences based on knowledge or social utility, they aren't the target here.
Unless they're abused or exploited.
Exactly. The modern focus is really on dismantling the unjust and alterable parts of the social structure that perpetuate disadvantage.
Okay, so if equality doesn't mean literally making everyone identical, what does it mean in practice? The source is explicit, not literal equalization.
No, that's a common straw man argument opponents use. The source defines it more like a progressive reduction of inequalities where they are thought to be unreasonable.
And what's unreasonable can change over time.
Absolutely. It evolves with social consciousness. Think about ancient societies. The legal difference between a master and a slave was considered reasonable then. Now, universally seen as profoundly unjust.
And it's not about everyone getting the exact same slice of the pie either. Same income, same goods.
Correct. The ideal isn't identical distribution of outcomes. It's more focused on ensuring that individuals, acknowledging they have different capacities and talents,
Are given equal opportunity.
equal opportunities for the development of their own potential, their personal qualities. Yes,
This sounds like it circles back to Tawny's idea, again, treating different people differently based on their needs and what they contribute.
it does. The source really emphasizes Tawny's point that justice isn't about treating everyone the same way regardless of their situation.
It's more nuanced.
It's about treating people similarly where their basic human needs are the same, but treating them differently where their different needs or capacities or the services they provide require different conditions to thrive.
Creating conditions for diverse talents to flourish.
Right, where different kinds of energy can be effectively expressed.
Okay. So since literal equality isn't the goal, the source identifies situations where making special provisions, things that might look like discrimination on the surface, is actually considered rational, aligned with equality.
Yes, it outlines these rational grounds for discrimination based on what it terms modern consciousness. It broadly divides them into two categories.
Which are?
First, making special provisions based on demonstrated need, and second, providing special rewards for exceptional excellence.
Let's dig into the need part first. This applies both to burdens, like taxes, and benefits.
That's right. On the burden side, the classic example is progressive taxation.
Higher income, higher tax rate.
Exactly. That's a form of discrimination based on economic capacity, but it's seen as rational because someone with a very low income may be just scraping by.
Has a greater need to keep that income for survival.
Right. So they're often spared or taxed minimally. And on the benefits and services side, the source lists numerous examples.
Like public services?
Public social services, transport, postal services, schools, hospitals, libraries, parks. They're often funded through general taxes, but people use them based on need, not strictly based on how much tax they paid.
Someone paying little tax might benefit hugely.
Absolutely. And there are more explicit examples, too.
Such as?
Scholarships that consider merit and means, where financial need is often the deciding factor once you meet a basic merit level.
Emergency aid for disasters.
Right. Public aid for victims of fire, flood, famine. The state providing essential but maybe uneconomic things, like roads in remote areas.
Or subsidizing essentials.
Subsidizing crucial goods, like food, water, energy, to meet community needs, all framed as rational discrimination based on need.
And this is also the justification for policies aimed at lifting up disadvantaged groups, things like reservations or affirmative action.
According to the source, yes. Policies like reservations for disadvantaged sections women, the handicapped, historically marginalized groups like scheduled caste tribes in India, they largely fit within this framework. Making special provisions based on demonstrated need that arises from historical or systemic disadvantage.
Okay, so need is one rational ground. What about the second one? Special reward for excellence. That feels a bit counterintuitive to equality at first.
It does seem that way, and the source tackles this head on. It confronts the argument that equality is just a philosophy of poverty that drags everyone down.
The idea that it lowers standards.
Right. Thinkers like David Hume worried that chasing equality would stifle innovation, hard work, skill, and ultimately make society poorer.
But the source says that's based on a misunderstanding.
A flawed understanding, yes. Assuming equality means literal equalization of rewards, regardless of talent, effort, or contribution.
Which, as we've established, isn't the goal here.
Exactly. A rational interpretation of equality, the source argues, neither implies equalization of results nor disrespect of excellence. In fact, recognizing and rewarding excellence is seen as compatible with, maybe even necessary for, a thriving, more equal society.
Especially after basic needs are met.
Yes, that's a key condition. providing special rewards for special talents and efforts, provided those efforts are beneficial to society as a whole.
The source gives some ridiculous interpretation examples to show what this isn't aiming for.
Yes, like giving the best violins to people who can't play a note, or the best books to students with no aptitude.
Or fancy clothes based just on looks.
Right. The source calls these out as absurd caricatures used by opponents to make equality look silly. Rational equality isn't about that.
So what is the actual goal when it comes to excellence?
The aim is to create the conditions, the incentives, where genuine talents can actually flourish, where exceptional efforts that benefit the community are properly recognized and rewarded.
So best instruments to the best players, best resources to the best students.
That's the idea.
But the source adds a really crucial caveat here. This isn't just endorsing any old system where people get rewarded for being good at something.
That's vital. The source is clear.
Yeah.
This isn't an unconditional thumbs up for a purely market-driven system focused only on private profit.
It's not about letting people make fortunes by manipulating others.
No, it's not about exploiting vulnerabilities. Under this rational view of equality, the basis for getting special rewards or distinctions should be the service rendered to society.
And that fosters fraternity, community spirit.
That's the suggestion, linking individual success and reward to contributions that benefit everyone, rather than just personal gain at any cost.
Okay. This brings us neatly to a really thorny issue, one the source highlights quite a bit: reverse discrimination.
Yes, the big one.
If you make these special provisions for historically disadvantaged groups based on need, doesn't that mean you're discriminating against others?
This is definitely a major challenge when you try to put the principle of special provision into practice. The source directly tackles this controversy around reverse discrimination.
Most visibly in the U.S., debates about affirmative action.
Exactly. For racial minorities, for women in areas like jobs and education.
And the core argument from opponents is, what? That these policies give preferential treatment based on race or sex.
Right, which they argue is inherently discriminatory, just flipping the script on past discrimination.
Using the same categories but in reverse.
Yes. They question the justification for using categories of past injustice as the basis for present-day preference. They argue it violates the principle of equal opportunity for all individuals, regardless of group identity.
But the source also presents the counter-arguments, right,
Yeah.
from those who support affirmative action.
Absolutely. One major argument is about compensation. The idea is, since groups like Black Americans or women faced systemic barriers and lost opportunities historically,
Affirmative action is needed to make up for that.
to compensate for past disadvantages and their ongoing effects, yes. Another argument focuses on achieving the substantive goal of equality, not just the formal principle.
Like actually seeing more Black doctors or women leaders.
Exactly. Seeing that as establishing a form of real equality that goes beyond just saying the door is open.
And there's also an argument tied back to that principle of provision based on need, especially when opportunities are limited.
Right. Proponents argue that in super competitive situations with few spots, just focusing on merit alone can actually perpetuate inequality because disadvantaged groups start so far behind.
So if someone from that group meets the minimum qualifications,
Preferential treatment based on their profound need and maybe the societal need for diversity can help them overcome those systemic barriers they might not otherwise clear.
okay, so those are the key arguments for affirmative action outlined in the source. What about the arguments against it, particularly from the view the source links to neoconservatism?
Opponents raise several strong points. Neoconservatives, the source notes, often argue equality should strictly mean equality of opportunity in a formal procedural way. Everyone plays by the same rules.
And they see things like affirmative action as harmful.
Detrimental, yes.
Mm.
They believe attempts to engineer more substantive equality undermine the principle of merit. They worry it erodes respect for traditional authority, which they see as vital for social stability and progress.
They also raise fairness concerns, both in process and outcome.
Yes. They argue it violates procedural justice by treating people based on group identity, not just individual actions or qualifications.
Leading to potentially unfair results.
Like the creamy layer issue, where relatively privileged people within a favored group benefit over poor or disadvantaged people outside that group. They also question the fairness of making the current generation essentially pay for past injustices.
Right. Injustices they didn't commit.
Exactly.
And there's also a point mentioned about personal dignity.
The source mentions the argument that getting a position or benefit because of group preference, rather than purely individual merit, could potentially harm their recipients' self-respect.
Leading to feelings of inferiority, or the perception their achievement isn't fully earned.
That's the concern raised, yes.
How does the source describe this playing out specifically in India?
It notes that while the debate is there, it hasn't maybe been as overtly polarized as elsewhere, partly due to a broad societal sympathy for historically deprived sections.
But there are still challenges.
A significant challenge highlighted is the practical difficulty of identifying who really needs the help most. There's a risk, especially with widespread poverty and limited resources.
That the benefits get cornered.
Exactly. By the more articulate, maybe relatively better off members within those disadvantaged groups, while the truly poor and marginalized miss out.
And this is where the Indian Supreme Court has weighed in.
Yes. The source points to key court rulings, trying to refine how reservations work. The court emphasized excluding that creamy layer to ensure benefits actually reach the genuinely disadvantaged.
And set limits.
Crucially, yes, ruling that the total percentage of reservations shouldn't generally exceed 50% of available spots, recognizing that going beyond that could become reverse discrimination against the general category.
And there was a suggestion noted about the best way to implement these policies. A sequence.
The source mentions a strong feeling within the debate that maybe it's better to first really focus on providing comprehensive education and professional opportunities. Level the playing field through investment in capabilities first.
Before requiring head-to-head competition.
Right. The idea is this might build more confidence and incentive for newer generations. But ultimately, the source concludes that finding a fair solution to this whole complex issue of reverse discrimination needs a very cautious, very nuanced approach.
Okay, so we've looked at equality as a principle, its history, where differences might be rational. Now, let's shift to how equality is understood and pursued in different areas of life. The source breaks this down into dimensions: legal, political, and socioeconomic.
These dimensions are like different battlegrounds, you could say, where the fight for equality is played out, starting with legal equality.
This seems like the most basic one. Everyone equal before the law.
On the surface, maybe, but achieving even that was a massive historical slog. Legal equality means giving everyone the same legal status, regardless of birth, social standing, innate abilities.
Rousseau saw this as key to civil society.
Yes, through the social contract. He argued that convention and legal right create a moral, lawful equality that replaces natural inequality. It's the foundation for equal rights.
And Barker's idea of the state giving everyone equal legal personalities, like masks.
Right, because everyone is supposed to matter equally before the law. So whatever rights and obligations the legal system defines, they must apply equally to everyone in the same situation.
But as you said, historically, this wasn't the case for a long time.
Not at all. The source gives some pretty stark examples of past legal inequality,
Like,
contrasting modern ideas with historical codes like Manusmriti in ancient India. Different punishments, different interest rates based on caste. Aristotle justifying legal distinctions for slaves because he thought they were less sensitive to pain.
wow.
And the source details that English legal history, cited by Barker, slaves denied legal capacity until 1772. Poor people denied the vote until 1918. Married women unable to own property until 1870. Women didn't get full voting rights until 1918.
It really highlights how deeply embedded legal inequality was. The fight was long.
Absolutely.
So what does equality before the law really mean today in practice, according to the source, beyond just the theory?
Drawing on J.R. Lucas, the source stresses it means equal access to the law to the courts. But courts are supposed to consider only legally relevant factors, no bias based on status, wealth, power.
Nobody too low to seek justice, nobody too high to be held accountable.
That's the ideal. Fair, impartial decisions, applied without fear or favor. Equal subjection to the law, equal protection by the law for every citizen.
But there's a big but coming, isn't there? The source points out a major limitation, especially in societies with huge economic gaps.
This is the critical caveat. The source argues that in a society with extreme wealth and poverty, just having formal legal equality isn't enough.
Why not?
Because the huge costs of legal action, the complexity of procedures, the vast differences in resources people have, it means formal equality can become effectively meaningless. Empty, the source says.
Lasky's point about wealth being decisive feels very relevant here.
Absolutely. Lasky is quoted noting that, in reality, wealth often holds the trump card in legal fights. Even with things like legal aid, pursuing justice remains a grim financial question for the poor.
The ablest lawyers will be at the service of those only who are able to afford them.
Exactly. Contrasting the experience of an innocent poor person versus a rich criminal who can hire the absolute best defense team. Lucas is quoted again. Justice is not served if the case of one party is incompetently presented and that of the other superbly well by the best barrister that money can buy.
The source mentions judges and legal aid as potential fixes, but implies they aren't enough.
It suggests judges should try to see cases in their socioeconomic context, but Lasky cautioned judges often come from privileged backgrounds themselves. Legal aid helps access, but the source suggests it has limits in truly balancing the scales against vast wealth.
So legal equality, a crucial achievement but inadequate on its own.
That's the conclusion drawn. It needs socioeconomic changes to become fully meaningful.
Okay, next dimension, political equality.
This one focuses on the equal distribution of political rights, primarily the right to participate in the political process.
One person, one vote.
That's the cornerstone. It also means no barriers to holding public office based on birth, religion, sex, status. No privileged ruling classes. Rulers should consider the common good of everyone.
And this is rooted in that idea of humans as rational beings, capable of political judgment.
Exactly. And the belief that universal participation is the best way to express the collective will and ensure government serves the common good.
It arose alongside legal equality, French Revolution era.
Yes, Raphael notes it emerged then, challenging the arbitrary privileges that kept political power in the hands of the rich and well-born. This movement evolved into democracy, universal suffrage, freedoms of political opinion and association.
So political equality led to democracy, a huge step. But the source suggests, like legal equality, it also proved insufficient. It didn't meet everyone's hopes.
Right, because political equality alone didn't fix the deep problems caused by ongoing socioeconomic inequality. And this is where Alexis de Tocqueville's insights, mentioned in the source, are so sharp.
He saw a tension between political equality and economic inequality.
He anticipated that this discrepancy equals citizenship on paper, but huge economic divides in reality just wasn't sustainable in a democracy.
He saw the political revolution inevitably leading to a second phase, a social and economic struggle.
Precisely. A conflict between the haves and the have-nots, property owners versus the working classes. He saw the working class and democracies shifting focus from just political demands to these fundamental social and economic questions.
Almost anticipating socialism?
In a way, yes. Anticipating the theoretical groundwork for socialism, which would put socioeconomic equality front and center.
And that brings us perfectly to the third and maybe most complex dimension, socioeconomic equality.
This one is seen as covering both social status and economic condition, which the source views as tightly linked. And unlike legal or political equality, which is sometimes be framed negatively, just the absence of discrimination.
Socioeconomic equality demands something more.
It demands a substantive, positive interpretation. It's presented as a real engine for radical social change.
And its origins are explicitly tied to socialism.
Yes, as Ben and Peters point out, the term social equality was consciously picked by early socialists to distinguish their goals from the legal and political ideals of, say, the French Revolution.
Because they saw those earlier ideals as insufficient.
Inadequate, yeah. Even potentially an illusion without changes in the socioeconomic structure.
Why an illusion? How could legal and political equality be an illusion without social equality?
Because, the source argues, if you don't tackle the underlying economic inequality, a wealthy elite can still effectively hold disproportionate political power.
Through influence. Money.
Influencing legislators, maybe getting sympathetic judges appointed, using their resources to navigate or even manipulate the legal and political systems. High legal costs, lack of resources mean that, in practice, equality before the law can remain just an empty phrase for the poor.
The source presents this almost like a historical baton pass. Yeah. Legal political equality was the goal of the bourgeoisie against feudalism.
And then socioeconomic equality became the goal of the proletariat against the capitalist class.
Aiming for a classless society in the Marxian view.
Exactly. Marxian socialism saw socioeconomic equality as the ultimate goal, requiring the overthrow of capitalism itself. The source suggests that while legal political equality were initially progressive, they later became associated with defending the status quo once the capitalist class was dominant. The demand for socioeconomic equality then became the new progressive banner.
And a core critique of capitalism from this socioeconomic viewpoint is that it only offers formal liberty, not substantive freedom.
Right. The argument is economic power translates directly into control. a small group owning essential resources, as Tony described it.
They get to call the shots.
They're in a position to dictate terms, exercise significant control over the lives of the majority who depend on them for their livelihood. That dependency fundamentally undermines real freedom.
So how is socioeconomic equality measured or perceived then? It's clearly not about literally everyone getting the exact same amount.
No, definitely not literal equalization. It's defined more as a progressive reduction of unjustifiable inequalities and the expansion of social benefits based on principles of social justice.
It's a shift in thinking, from formal and static to substantive and dynamic.
Exactly. A shift from equality as just the absence of discrimination, formal, negative, static, to equality as actively working towards greater fairness and opportunity, substantive, positive, dynamic.
This brings us back to that difference between formal equality of opportunity and socioeconomic equality of opportunity.
Crucial distinction. Formal equality means the doors are legally open to everyone, no discrimination based on race, sex, etc.
But that doesn't mean everyone can actually walk through them.
Exactly. The source argues it doesn't mean opportunities are equally available or accessible because of existing structural inequalities. It can be just a mere piece of decoration. Looks nice, open to all in theory, but practically only reachable by a few.
Whereas socioeconomic equality insists on
The progressive equalization of those opportunities, by actually addressing the underlying conditions that create disadvantage in the first place.
And the source mentions some influential formulas or ideals linked to this.
Yes. For the ultimate ideal, the fully communist society, it cites Louis Blanc and Marx's famous formula, from each according to his ability to each according to his need.
And for the transition phase, socialism.
Lenin adapted it too, from each according to his ability to each according to his work. He admitted this was still a form of bourgeois right, but saw it as necessary then to ensure everyone's right to work, basic maintenance, meeting essential needs.
So socioeconomic equality really grounds this principle of the right to satisfy basic needs, which implies a big role for the state.
Absolutely. It supports the state having a responsibility to provide or at least ensure access to essential services.
Like education, jobs, housing.
Education, employment opportunities, basic housing, necessary social amenities like transport, fair-priced shops, hospitals, parks. Also, state regulation of things like working conditions, wages, compensation, pensions, all seen as tools for socioeconomic equality.
And how is this typically funded, especially in a welfare state model?
Primarily through progressive taxation. As Wolfgang Friedman observed, making those with larger incomes or more wealth pay a proportionally higher rate is key.
It does two things.
Right. It helps mitigate wealth inequality and curb the power of property when it's used just for private profit instead of social good. And it finances those extensive social services, which are then provided based on need, not just on how much tax someone paid.
The source seems to contrast two main strategies here. The Marxian idea of completely replacing the system versus a more liberal approach of making adjustments within capitalism.
Yes, highlighting those different paths envisioned to get towards a more socioeconomically equal society.
This whole discussion loops us right back to that fundamental tension we started with, the relationship between liberty and equality.
The million-dollar question.
The source presents it as complex. They can be complementary, or they can contradict each other. It really depends on how you interpret them.
This is really the core philosophical battleground. The complementary view, championed by thinkers like Tawney, Lasky, McPherson, it argues liberty and equality aren't rivals. They actually depend on each other.
Liberty needs equality to be meaningful for everyone.
Pretty much. For liberty to mean something for more than just a privileged few, it needs equality.
Because liberty implies equal liberty. My freedom shouldn't destroy yours.
Exactly. From this perspective, putting limits on individual freedom is often necessary just to make sure that freedom is equally distributed, equally enjoyed by all.
And property comes into this.
The source highlights how, especially in modern societies, property can become this powerful tool for exploitation, allowing those who control key resources to exert undue influence over others.
So huge socioeconomic gaps are seen as incompatible with real freedom for most people.
Fundamentally incompatible with substantive freedom, yes.
Yeah.
Therefore, achieving substantive freedom requires actively working towards substantive equality, reducing those disparities.
And the source suggests those who benefit from big disparities try to obscure this link.
That they often try to hide this complementary relationship between liberty, equality, and justice. They argue that equality demands changing the social arrangements that give one group too much control over the lives and chances of others.
But as you said, there's that powerful opposing view that equality is actually an impediment to liberty.
This perspective sees equality, especially the pursuit of socioeconomic equality through state action, as inherently threatening individual liberty.
Like Tocqueville's concerns.
Yes, Tocqueville worried that equality, by flattening social hierarchies, could lead to conformity, making people too susceptible to public opinion, increasing centralized state power.
Leading to a tyranny of the majority.
Potentially, yes. Suppressing individual dissent, independent thought in the political sphere. Lord Acton echoed this, fearing equality boosted state power by weakening other independent centers of authority.
And they focused mainly on the political sphere, proposing things like decentralization.
Right. Tocqueville and Acton saw the tension mainly there, proposing solutions like decentralization, strong independent groups, parties, press as buffers for individual liberty. John Stuart Mill strongly supported protecting dissenting individuals too.
But this opposition runs deep in the economic sphere too. Figures like Isaiah Berlin.
Yes. Berlin, famous for distinguishing negative liberty, freedom from interference, from positive liberty, freedom to achieve self-mastery, argued the state's main job was protecting negative liberty.
And crucially, how did he view socioeconomic disadvantage?
He tended to lump things like being too poor to afford something in with what he saw as unalterable limitations, like, not being able to fly.
And the source is pretty critical of that framing.
Very critical. It argues Berlin presented a distorted view by equating alterable socioeconomic conditions, which are products of social arrangements, with unalterable natural facts. By separating liberty from socioeconomic equality this way, the source suggests, Berlin's argument actually weakens liberty itself, making it seem okay with extreme disadvantage.
And then there's the huge figure of F.A. Hayek, a major voice arguing against pursuing equality.
Hayek is central to this opposing view. In works like The Constitution of Liberty, he argued that natural differences in skills and effort, combined with legal equality under rule of law, legitimately lead to unequal incomes and wealth.
And trying to reduce those outcomes.
Any attempt by the state to forcibly reduce those outcomes through major intervention would require authoritarian methods that, for Hayek, would inevitably destroy individual freedom.
He seemed to put liberty above everything else as the engine of progress.
Yes. Hayek believed focusing on equal outcomes would stifle innovation, effort. He used analogies: don't hold back the fastest runners just so everyone finishes together.
Let the most capable advance fully, even if others lag. Because overall progress benefits society more.
Exactly. Prioritize individual achievement enabled by freedom over equal distribution. He famously dismissed social justice as a mirage, an unrealizable ideal.
For him, justice was just procedural fairness. Playing by the rules.
Right. Not about the overall distribution in society. Liberty alone was the principle worth pursuing. While he conceded the state might provide some basic public services outside the market.
The source notes he was vague on how to pay for them.
A bit unclear, yes. Without diverting resources from the market system, he championed. The source's overall critique of Hayek is that by divorcing liberty so completely from social justice, his view ultimately undermines the broader humanistic goals, often linked with liberty. The source tries to find some middle ground, suggesting the conflict often comes from biased interpretations.
That seems to be the takeaway. In the legal and political spheres, finding a balance, even complementarity, between liberty and equality, equal liberty, one vote, seems achievable. But it's the socioeconomic sphere where it gets really tricky.
That's where the tension is most pronounced, most subject to conflicting views.
Yeah.
The source's position appears to be legal and political equality are vital, but they can become ineffective, even mask inequality, without addressing the underlying socioeconomic structure.
Lasky's historical view supports that complementary idea. Liberty originally arose against privilege, implying equality.
Yes. Lasky argued when society is very unequal, power inevitably concentrates. That elite then uses the state for its own interests, making private desires the public good.
So the core economic fight is, does liberty mean unlimited gain? And does equality, by limiting that, stifle initiative?
Right. But proponents of rational equality say, no, it's not about limiting legitimate achievement. It's about fair shares, fair opportunities, not identical shares.
And the source concludes that differential rewards based on social service are okay.
Compatible with both liberty and equality, yes, unless it's stretched too far. used to justify state indifference to extreme inequality or argue against any limits on pure competition. That, the source says, is disastrous.
That word disastrous really lands the point about the dangers of separating liberty from social justice.
It does. It suggests unchecked liberty, without regard for equity, leads to outcomes bad for human well-being and a just society.
Okay, finally, let's look at the relationship between equality and justice itself. Again, the source says, complex, depends on interpretation.
It starts with Aristotle, his foundational principle. Justice means treating equals equally and unequals unequally.
He also worried.
He worried that people equal in one way, like being citizens, might then demand equality in everything, power, wealth. And if they don't get it, that could lead to perceived injustice, maybe rebellion. He even suggested states might need to suppress the equality idea to keep the peace.
And the source says, thinkers today who want to keep existing inequalities often echo Aristotle, claiming that's justice.
Yes, arguing that challenging the current distribution is itself unjust. Hayek, again, is the prime example. His mirage of social justice argued social justice is meaningless because justice only applies to individual conduct.
Society itself can't be just or unjust.
Not in his view. He thought curtailing liberty for equality created tension and undermined real justice, which for him was procedural, ensuring fair rules, maximizing freedom for self-interest in the market.
And this view forms the basis for what the source calls libertarianism.
Correct. In the system, capable, resourceful individuals face minimal state obstruction. No expectation to worry about the poor. The rich aren't taxed for welfare.
It champions procedural justice, social relations, market relations.
Pretty much. Equality just means equal subjection to common rules. The state's only role is preventing harm by force or fraud. Whatever outcomes result from following the rules, even vast inequality, are deemed acceptable, just.
And in sharp contrast, the source presents egalitarianism.
Egalitarians take the opposite view. Equality is always just. It's inequalities that need justification. John Rawls is cited, grounding his justice principles in liberty and equality, trying to find conditions where inequalities might be considered just.
This view emphasizes a different kind of responsibility.
It does. Egalitarians believe society's structure should ensure the poor and weak have real chances to flourish alongside the rich and strong. They argue the fortunate do have a responsibility towards the deprived, even if they didn't directly cause it, just by being part of the same society.
They criticize indifference to the needy.
Yes, indifference done in the name of liberty or just procedural fairness. They champion substantive justice, meaning positive action, positive improvement for the poor and weaker sections. It demands radical change to remove unreasonable inequalities everywhere, legal, political, socioeconomic. Direct opposition to the libertarian defense of the status quo.
So, to boil down the contrast, libertarians defend the current order via procedural justice, self-interest, the market. Egalitarians demand change via substantive justice, collective responsibility, creating opportunities for the disadvantaged.
And the source wraps this section with that incredibly potent quote from L.T. Hobhouse.
Which one was that?
Justice is a name to which every knee will bow. Equality is a word which many fear and detest.
Wow, that really hits home, doesn't it? Everyone claims their side is just, even if it results in huge inequality.
Right. Everyone pays lip service to justice.
But the word equality, that directly challenges the existing setup. Power, wealth, opportunity.
Exactly. And because it threatens to alter those structures, it's feared and fought against by those who benefit most from the current state of inequality.
Wow, what a deep dive that was. We've really unpacked this concept of equality, moving from its basic nature as a right, not a fact, tracing its rise as this modern demand for social change.
Exploring how it plays out differently in the legal, political, socioeconomic realms.
And digging into those complex, often conflicting relationships with liberty and justice, all guided strictly by the arguments presented in our source material.
And by grappling with these different interpretations, these historical contexts, the specific arguments laid out here, hopefully you, our listener, now have a clearer lens, a better way to view the ongoing debates about fairness, rights, the very foundations of our social structures.
It really shows how that single word, equality, can mean such different things, depending on who's talking, which dimension they're focused on.
From just equal treatment under law to everyone getting a vote, all the way to demanding radical shifts in economic power and opportunity.
And that tension, say, between just following the rules, procedural justice, and making sure everyone has a shot at a decent life, substantive justice, that feels absolutely central to so many policy arguments today.
It really is.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on, building on everything we've discussed from the source. Given this analysis of the need for substantive socioeconomic equality, but also the complexities around literal equalization and the arguments for rational differences based on need and contribution, how do societies actually navigate this?
How do you practically achieve that goal of significantly reducing unjust inequalities, ensuring real opportunity for the many?
While still recognizing genuine merit, addressing diverse needs fairly.
It's the balancing act that's defined so much political thought for centuries. And it's a question that feels incredibly relevant, incredibly challenging right here, right now.